Ever been judged before you even spoke a word? Lila Carter walked into a courtroom expecting justice, but left with a fine so steep it felt personal. Little did the judge know, the woman he dismissed would soon become the face of a movement that would change his courtroom and his life forever. The morning sun poured through the towering windows of the Harris County Courthouse, casting long streaks of light across the polished floors and wooden benches. It was a typical Monday in courtroom 4B, crowded, tense, and buzzing with a mix of anxiety and impatience. Among the chaotic hum of papers, shuffling and murmured voices, one figure stood out, Judge Robert Greer. Known for his curt demeanor and reputation for delivering harsh rulings, Judge Greer presided over the room with an iron grip. His graying hair and furrowed brow gave him the air of a man who had long abandoned patience for efficiency. He barked through the docket, dismissing cases with quick, heavy-handed judgments. To him, justice was a conveyor belt, not a nuanced pursuit of fairness. Case 753, Lila Bryant, minor parking violation. The clerk announced. Breaking through the courtroom's din, Lila rose from her seat, her tailored gray pantsuit immaculate and her expression calm. In her early 30s, with deep brown skin and sharp, discerning eyes, she exuded quiet confidence. But as she approached the bench, her composed exterior belied the frustration simmering beneath. Judge Greer barely glanced at her as he opened her file. "Miss Bryant," he said without looking up, his tone flat and dismissive. "You've been cited for parking in a restricted zone. Do you contest this charge?" Lila took a steadying breath. "Your Honor, if I may explain," he cut her off with a wave of his hand, his voice sharp. "This is not a debate. Miss Bryant, I asked a simple question. Do you contest the charge?" The courtroom grew quieter as curious eyes turned toward the exchange. Lila's jaw tightened briefly, but she quickly relaxed her face, choosing her words carefully. "No, Your Honor, I do not contest the charge. However, the circumstances, then I see no reason for leniency." Greer interrupted, leaning back in his chair. "You are fined $1,000, payable within 30 days. Next case." The sound of his gavel striking the bench rang out like a thunderclap, silencing even the faintest murmurs. Lila stood motionless for a beat, her expression unchanging. She met Greer's gaze with calm intensity, thanked him with a curt nod, and turned to leave. Her heels clicked against the marble floors as she exited the courtroom, each step measured and deliberate. Judge Greer watched her leave, a flicker of unease stirring in his chest. Something about her composure, so out of place in a room full of nervous defendants, unsettled him. But he quickly brushed the thought aside and moved on to the next case, his voice booming once more. Yet as the courtroom continued its relentless rhythm, Lila Bryant's quiet grace lingered in the air, like the echo of a story not yet finished. Lila Johnson's story was one of resilience. Growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood in Chicago, she was surrounded by both community warmth and systemic challenges. The streets where she played as a child were lined with murals celebrating black excellence, but also marked by the scars of economic disparity and neglect. Lila's parents, a public school teacher and a mechanic, instilled in her the value of hard work and education. They often reminded her that while the world might not always be fair, knowledge and determination could pave her way forward. From an early age, Lila excelled academically, her love for debate and writing setting her apart. She had dreams of becoming a lawyer, envisioning herself standing in courtrooms fighting for justice. But her path shifted in college when she took an investigative journalism class. Uncovering hidden truths and holding power accountable sparked a new passion. Lila realized she could affect change, not just through the legal system, but by shedding light on the injustices that often went unnoticed. She graduated magna cum laude with a degree in journalism, determined to use her voice as a force for good. Now in her late 30s, Lila had carved out a name for herself as a legal analyst for the Justice Report, a smaller but respected news outlet that focused on courtroom proceedings and systemic inequities. Her role often involved analyzing court cases, explaining legal nuances to the public, and highlighting patterns of bias within the justice system. It was a job she approached with meticulous care, knowing that her words could shape public understanding and even policy discussions. Lila's personal experiences with racism added layers of urgency to her work. She had felt the sting of discrimination countless times, whether it was being followed in stores, dismissed in professional settings, or, as with her recent parking violation case, penalized unfairly in a courtroom. Each instance reminded her why her work mattered. She knew her case against Judge Greer wasn't just about the $1,000 fine. It was a microcosm of a much larger issue, the systemic biases that disproportionately affected Black Americans in every facet of life, including the justice system. Her personal stakes were high. Lila wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the countless others who didn't have the platform or resources to push back. The experience with Greer had ignited something within her, a determination to not only hold him accountable, but to use her story as a catalyst for broader change. As Lila sat at her desk that evening, reviewing footage from a recent trial she had covered, her mind wandered back to her courtroom encounter. Greer's dismissive tone, the way he had barely looked at her, and the steep fine all played on a loop in her head. But instead of dwelling on the frustration, she focused on her next steps. This was more than just a personal slight. It was an opportunity to expose a system in need of reform. Lila stared at the court document detailing the $1,000 fine for a minor parking violation. It wasn't the financial burden that gnawed at her. It was the sheer injustice of it. The memory of Judge Greer's dismissive tone and quick judgment replayed in her mind. She had seen it too often before, systemic inequities manifesting in small, everyday interactions that left lasting scars. But this time, she decided it wouldn't end quietly. That evening, Lila crafted a post for social media. She began by recounting the incident in detail, careful to focus on facts rather than emotion. She described how Judge Greer had barely glanced at her as he handed down an excessive fine, brushing aside her attempts to clarify her position. "This isn't just about me," she wrote. "It's about how systemic bias operates in spaces that are supposed to be fair and impartial. How many others have faced the same treatment and couldn't fight back?" She hesitated for a moment before hitting post, knowing that sharing her experience could invite both support and scrutiny. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the post began to gain traction. Comments flooded in from people who had faced similar injustices, minorities who felt targeted by the justice system, defendants fined disproportionately, and others who shared their frustration with Greer's courtroom. Some messages were supportive. "Thank you for speaking up." Others carried a tone of weary solidarity. "I know exactly what you're talking about. This has to stop." A few, however, accused her of playing the race card, an all-too-familiar retort that only fueled her resolve. As the post went viral, local activists and community organizations reached out, eager to amplify her story. Reporters began contacting her, seeking interviews about her experience and her perspective on systemic racism in the courts. Lila was initially hesitant. She hadn't shared her story for fame or attention. But as the outpouring of support grew, so did her sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her parking violation anymore. It was about shining a light on the broader issues at play. Encouraged by the momentum, Lila dug deeper into Judge Greer's track record. Using public records and court transcripts, she began to notice a troubling pattern. Greer's rulings were consistently harsher for Black and Hispanic defendants compared to their white counterparts. Even for similar offenses, minor infractions, like traffic violations or small fines, often carried maximum penalties under his gavel. Lila compiled her findings into a detailed report, weaving in stories shared by others who had been in his courtroom. Lila's story and report caught the attention of larger media outlets. Invitations to speak on national platforms followed. She appeared on legal podcasts and evening news segments, discussing her experience and the broader implications of judicial bias. Her calm, articulate demeanor resonated with viewers, and her sharp insights earned her respect across professional circles. But with the attention came challenges. Critics accused her of exaggerating her claims or attempting to undermine the justice system. Online trolls bombarded her with hateful messages, questioning her credibility and motives. Lila leaned on her community for support. drawing strength from the many voices rallying behind her, fueled by the outcry. Lila realized her next step was clear. She needed to act. Her reporting had started a conversation, but she wanted to push for tangible change. She began collaborating with local legal aid organizations and civil rights groups, strategizing ways to address systemic issues in the courts. They discussed proposals for judicial accountability measures, including transparency in sentencing and implicit bias training for judges. What had begun as a routine court appearance had transformed into a catalyst for change. Lila's voice had reached beyond the courtroom, inspiring others to share their stories and demand accountability. She wasn't just exposing injustice, she was galvanizing a movement. Lila's rise from a local journalist to a nationally recognized legal analyst wasn't overnight, but it was fueled by her relentless pursuit of truth and justice. The viral post about her encounter with Judge Greer had thrust her into the spotlight, but it was her sharp intellect and eloquence that kept her there. As she navigated this new chapter, her focus remained clear: to use her voice to challenge systemic injustice and amplify those who couldn't. The initial surge of attention brought Lila opportunities she had only dreamed of. Major news networks invited her to provide commentary on high-profile legal cases. Her ability to break down complex judicial issues into accessible, relatable narratives made her a favorite among viewers. Lila's insights weren't just informative, they were empowering, equipping her audience with the tools to question the fairness of the systems around them. One of her first major appearances was on a nationally syndicated talk show. The host introduced her as a fresh and fearless voice in the fight for judicial reform. Lila felt a mix of excitement and nerves as she took her seat. But the moment she began speaking, her confidence took over. She spoke about her experience in Greer's courtroom, not as a personal grievance, but as a reflection of a broader, systemic problem. "What happened to me is just one example," she said. "For every story like mine that goes viral, there are countless others that remain unheard." The audience's response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Social media buzzed with praise for her clarity and courage. But as her profile grew, so did the scrutiny. Lila found herself navigating a delicate balance, being accessible without being reduced to a soundbite, advocating for change without losing sight of her journalistic integrity. Her reporting expanded beyond courtroom injustices. She delved into issues of policing, bail reform, and the disparities in sentencing between racial and socioeconomic groups. Her articles combined meticulous research with compelling human stories, earning her accolades in both journalism and legal communities. Despite her success, Lila often battled self-doubt. Imposter syndrome crept in during quiet moments, whispering that she wasn't qualified enough or that her voice didn't matter. The criticism she faced, both from trolls and from those within her profession, sometimes weighed heavily. "Stick to reporting," one email read, "and leave the legal talk to the experts." But Lila reminded herself of why she had started. She thought about the people who had reached out after her post about Judge Greer, sharing their stories and thanking her for speaking up. She leaned on her support network, her mother, her colleagues, and a close-knit group of friends who believed in her even when she doubted herself. Her determination paid off. Lila became a trusted voice in the legal world, often invited to moderate panels or speak at conferences about judicial reform. One highlight was an invitation to a national symposium on systemic racism in the courts. Standing before a room full of judges, lawyers, and policymakers, Lila spoke about the intersection of race and justice with passion and precision. Her words resonated, sparking thoughtful discussions and new alliances. As Lila's career flourished, so did her influence. She used her platform to advocate for transparency in the legal system, calling for reforms that would hold judges accountable for biased rulings. She wasn't just reporting on change, she was driving it. Lila's journey wasn't without obstacles, but each challenge reinforced her purpose. She had started out as a journalist covering courtroom proceedings, and now she was shaping the very conversations she once reported on. The courtroom buzzed with tension as one of the year's most controversial trials began, a case involving police misconduct that had ignited protests across the country. The stakes were enormous. The trial not only placed the officer on trial, but also exposed systemic failures that had long gone unaddressed. Lila Carter sat in the studio, preparing to deliver live analysis for a national network. She adjusted her earpiece, her heart racing with a mix of anticipation and responsibility. Her role as a legal analyst had grown since her encounter with Judge Greer, but this trial marked a pivotal moment. It was the first time she would provide commentary on a case presided over by the very judge who had fined her months earlier. Lila's calm, professional demeanor masked the whirlwind of emotions brewing beneath the surface. The trial opened with dramatic arguments from both sides. The defense painted the officer as a victim of a volatile situation, while the prosecution presented damning evidence of excessive force, including a harrowing video that had gone viral. Lila watched the proceedings from a studio monitor, her pen gliding across a notepad as she prepared her points. When the host turned to her, Lila spoke with measured authority. This case isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about the broader implications for accountability and reform. She explained, "What's particularly noteworthy here is Judge Greer's handling of the case. He's known for his stern rulings, but how he navigates such a high-profile trial will set a significant precedent." As the trial unfolded over days, Lila's analysis became a staple of the network's coverage. Her ability to dissect legal arguments and explain their implications in simple terms resonated with viewers. Her insights often went viral, sparking discussions across social media platforms. Despite her professionalism, Lila couldn't ignore the personal connection to Judge Greer. During one broadcast, she addressed it subtly, sharing her own experience of judicial bias without mentioning his name. Bias, whether implicit or overt, can influence outcomes in ways we often underestimate, she said. This trial serves as a reminder that every decision made in the courtroom carries weight beyond the immediate case. Her words struck a chord, prompting a flood of messages from viewers. Many commended her courage for speaking out, while others shared their own stories of bias in the justice system. Lila felt the weight of their trust, knowing her voice represented more than just her own perspective. In the courtroom, Judge Greer remained as stoic as ever, but Lila noticed subtle shifts in his demeanor. He listened more attentively, his rulings less abrupt and more deliberate. Whether it was the gravity of the case or something deeper, Lila couldn't tell, but the change was undeniable. Outside the studio, Lila's work extended beyond her broadcasts. She collaborated with legal experts and community leaders to highlight systemic issues exposed by the trial. She hosted webinars and wrote op-eds, using her platform to amplify calls for reform. One evening, after a particularly intense day of coverage, Lila received an email from a viewer who identified herself as a law student. "You inspire me to use my voice." The email read, "Watching you has shown me that the legal field isn't just about rules and cases. It's about people." The message brought tears to Lila's eyes. It reminded her of why she had pivoted to journalism in the first place, to shine a light on injustices and empower others to seek change. As the trial neared its conclusion, Lila reflected on her journey. The experience in Judge Greer's courtroom had been a catalyst, propelling her into a role she never anticipated but fully embraced. Now, as the world watched the verdict unfold, she felt a deep sense of purpose. The trial ended with a guilty verdict, a rare moment of accountability that sent ripples through the nation. Lila covered the aftermath with her signature blend of insight and empathy, emphasizing the need for continued vigilance and reform. The case had been a turning point, not just for the justice system, but for Lila herself. She had turned a moment of bias and dismissal into a platform for advocacy and change, proving that one voice could indeed make a difference. Months after the high-profile trial, Lila Carter was invited to speak at a prestigious legal conference on systemic bias in the judiciary. The invitation was an acknowledgement of her growing influence as a legal analyst and advocate. She prepared meticulously, weaving personal anecdotes with data-driven insights to craft a presentation that would both educate and inspire. Unbeknownst to Lila, Judge Albert Greer was also on the guest list. He had been invited as a panelist on judicial ethics, a role he reluctantly accepted after months of self-reflection. While he had tried to move past their earlier encounter, Lila's story and subsequent rise to prominence had left a lasting imprint on him. The conference was abuzz with energy, attended by judges, attorneys, academics, and activists from across the country. Lila arrived early, her calm demeanor concealing the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. She was accustomed to public speaking, but the weight of this particular event felt different. As the audience settled into their seats, Lila took the stage. The room hushed as she began, her voice clear and confident. Good evening. I'm honored to be here to discuss a topic that touches every corner of our justice system, implicit bias, and its impact on judicial fairness. She spoke about systemic inequities, drawing from her personal experience with Judge Greer without mentioning his name. Her story resonated with the room, her words a mirror for many attendees' unspoken experiences. I stood before a judge once, not as an advocate or analyst, but as a defendant, she said, her tone steady. I was fined excessively, dismissed summarily, and judged unfairly, not because of my actions, but because of assumptions. That moment stayed with me, not as a point of anger, but as a call to action from his seat in the audience. Judge Greer froze. The memory of their courtroom encounter flashed vividly in his mind. He recognized the poise and composure in her voice, the same qualities that had unsettled him that day. Lila continued, addressing the broader issue of systemic bias. Bias isn't always overt. It can manifest in subtle ways, a tone, a decision, a moment of dismissal. And yet, those moments have ripple effects that extend far beyond the courtroom. The audience erupted into applause as she concluded her speech. Lila stepped off the stage, meeting a wave of handshakes and compliments. As she navigated the crowd, she found herself face to face with Judge Greer. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of unspoken words hung between them. Greer, visibly uncomfortable, extended his hand. Miss Carter, or should I say, Ms. Carter, he began awkwardly. Your speech was compelling. Thank you, Your Honor, Lila replied, her tone professional but pointed. I'm glad you found it so. Greer hesitated, then cleared his throat. I believe we may have crossed paths before. Lila nodded, her expression neutral. We have... He began, but words failed him. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but his pride and discomfort made it difficult. Sensing his struggle, Lila decided to meet him halfway. Your Honor, what's important is what we do moving forward. Reflection is the first step toward progress. Her words were both a challenge and an olive branch. Greer nodded, his expression softening. You've given me much to think about. Ms. Carter, thank you for that. As Lila walked away, she felt a sense of closure. She didn't need an apology or validation from Judge Greer. The true victory was a conversation they had started, one that extended beyond the walls of any courtroom. After the conference, Judge Albert Greer returned to his chambers, feeling a mix of emotions. Lila Carter's speech had been a mirror, reflecting his own actions back at him in stark detail. Her words about bias and its ripple effects lingered, cutting through his usual defenses. Greer had always prided himself on being a fair and impartial judge, but Lila's story had struck a nerve. He couldn't ignore the parallels between her anecdote and their courtroom encounter months earlier. Her composed demeanor that day, her professionalism despite his dismissive tone, it all came rushing back. Alone in his office, Greer opened the docket from the day Lila had stood before him. He reread the case notes and his ruling. There was the $1,000 fine for a minor traffic violation. Excessive, arbitrary, unfair. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. Had he really been so quick to dismiss her? And if so, how many others had he treated the same way? For the first time in years, Greer decided to review his own records. Pulling up data from past cases, he searched for patterns. It wasn't long before troubling trends began to emerge. Defendants of color, particularly black women and men, had consistently received harsher fines and stricter sentences compared to their white counterparts. Greer had justified each decision at the time as adherence to the law, but now he saw a disturbing bias in his rulings. He closed the file and rested his head in his hands. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. For decades, He had convinced himself he was blind to race and socioeconomic status, judging only the facts of each case. But Lila's words had peeled back that illusion, forcing him to confront the truth. Over the next few weeks, Greer sought out resources on implicit bias. He read articles, attended workshops, and engaged in difficult conversations with colleagues. He even reached out to a local nonprofit that specialized in judicial reform, asking for guidance on implementing fairer practices in his courtroom. One afternoon, he sat down with his clerk, a young black man named James who had recently joined his team. Greer hesitated before speaking. "James, can I ask you something candid?" "Of course, Your Honor," James replied, curious. Greer sighed. "Do you think my rulings come across as unfair?" James shifted uncomfortably, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, I think you're very by the book. But sometimes, the book doesn't account for what people are going through. I've seen defendants leave this courtroom feeling like they weren't really heard." Greer nodded slowly. It was a diplomatic answer, but it confirmed what he had begun to realize on his own. That evening, Greer drafted a memo to his staff, outlining new protocols for his courtroom. These included allowing defendants more time to explain their circumstances, reassessing the use of fines, and undergoing regular bias training. He also planned to start working with community organizations to better understand the experiences of those who came before him. He thought back to Lila's speech in her quiet yet powerful confrontation at the conference. She hadn't berated him or demanded an apology. Instead, she had challenged him to do better, to see people for who they truly were, beyond their case files. For the first time in years, Greer felt the weight of accountability pressing on his shoulders. It was uncomfortable but necessary. That night, he sat in his study, drafting a handwritten letter to Lila. "Dear Ms. Carter, your words at the conference resonated deeply with me. They forced me to look inward and confront aspects of my judgments I had long ignored. For that, I owe you my gratitude. Thank you for being the voice that inspired change, not just in the system, but in me personally. Sincerely, Judge Albert Greer." As he sealed the envelope, Greer felt a sense of relief. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it. After the conference, Lila Carter found herself at the center of a growing movement. Her speech about systemic bias had resonated far beyond the legal conference, sparking conversations on social media and gaining traction among grassroots organizations. She wasn't just a legal analyst anymore. She had become a voice for judicial reform, determined to channel this momentum into tangible change. Lila launched an advocacy campaign aimed at judicial accountability. She partnered with community leaders, legal experts, and nonprofits to create a platform for education and action. The campaign focused on 3 key areas: bias training for judges, transparency in sentencing data, and better oversight of judicial conduct. Using her platform as a legal analyst, Lila crafted a series of exposés on systemic injustice within the judiciary. She conducted interviews with individuals who had experienced unfair treatment in court, amplifying their stories and tying them to larger patterns. One article, titled "Behind the Bench: The Faces of Bias in Our Courts," went viral, prompting discussions on national news outlets. But Lila didn't stop at raising awareness. She organized town hall meetings and workshops where community members could share their experiences and learn about their rights. At one such event, a young black woman stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "I thought I was alone in this," she said, "but hearing you speak, Ms. Carter, makes me feel seen. Thank you for fighting for us." Those moments reaffirmed Lila's mission. She realized that her work was about more than exposing problems. It was about empowering people to demand better from the system. Lila's efforts caught the attention of state lawmakers, who invited her to testify at a hearing on judicial reform. Standing before the legislative committee, she presented a compelling case for change, drawing on data, personal stories, and her own experiences. Bias in our courts isn't just an issue of fairness, she told the committee. It undermines the very foundation of justice. If we want our legal system to serve everyone equally, we need accountability and transparency at every level. Her testimony helped push forward a bill that proposed mandatory bias training for judges and public reporting of sentencing disparities. Though the bill faced resistance from some quarters, it gained widespread public support, thanks in part to Lila's advocacy. Meanwhile, Lila continued her work as a legal analyst, using her growing platform to highlight stories of resilience and reform. She balanced her professional responsibilities with her advocacy, finding purpose in the intersection of her roles. One evening, as she reviewed her notes for a live segment, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Judge Albert Greer. The subject line read, "Thank you." She opened it and read his heartfelt acknowledgement of her impact. It was a small but significant sign that her work was reaching even those who had once been part of the problem. For Lila, this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was ongoing, but she was ready to face it head-on. Months after her advocacy campaign had gained national traction, Lila Carter found herself back in the courthouse where it all began. This time, she wasn't there to cover a trial or testify about systemic injustice. She was there to observe, to see if the seeds of change she had planted had begun to grow. Courtroom 4B looked the same: polished benches, tall windows letting in beams of sunlight, and a hum of muted conversations. But something about the energy in the room felt different. Judge Albert Greer entered, his expression composed but notably softer. He took his place at the bench, his gavel resting calmly in his hand. As the proceedings began, Lila paid close attention to his demeanor. Greer's once brusque, dismissive tone had been replaced with deliberate consideration. He asked questions, sought clarification, and spoke with a measured respect that hadn't been present before. During a case involving a young man charged with a misdemeanor, Greer paused. After hearing the defense's argument, "I understand the context here," he said, his voice firm but empathetic. "I'll consider alternative sentencing options that focus on rehabilitation." Lila felt a small flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't a sweeping transformation, but it was progress, a step toward the justice she had envisioned. As the session ended, Greer glanced toward the gallery. His eyes landed on Lila. For a moment, their gazes locked, and he gave her a slight nod. It wasn't just a gesture of acknowledgement. It was an unspoken apology, a recognition of the impact she had made. Lila returned the nod, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't need words to convey her message. The work spoke for itself. Later that evening, Lila sat at her desk, typing the final paragraphs of an article for a major publication. The piece was titled "The Long Arc of Justice: How One Case Sparked a Movement." It chronicled her journey from being fined in Greer's courtroom to becoming a leading voice for judicial reform. As she wrote, she reflected on the power of persistence and grace. Change wasn't immediate, nor was it easy, but it was possible. Her phone buzzed with a notification, an email from a young student studying law. "Ms. Carter, your story inspired me to pursue a career where I can fight for justice. Thank you for showing me that one voice can make a difference." Lila smiled, her heart swelling with pride and hope. She hit publish on her article and leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window at the city lights. The journey wasn't over. There were more battles to fight, more voices to uplift, more systems to challenge. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that her efforts had already created ripples of change. As the city buzzed with life around her, Lila knew one thing for certain: justice wasn't just a destination. It was a journey, and she was ready for every step ahead.